So today I'm going to be talking about the most brutal methods of torture in history. And I'm gonna be honest, this is one of my favorite parts of history, like torture, executions, and it's really weird and I'm seriously judged every time I mention it. But I just find it really interesting how other people suffered. Like not in I enjoy suffering, I just enjoy studying about it. But I get judged whenever I say that, so now you know. Well, these are both like torture methods, also execution methods. They're really brutal. See, I love this topic. Well, first of all is the Brazen Bull. Well, this dates all the way back to ancient Greece, and if you're wondering what the Brazen Bull is, it's just a bull, like a piece of brass in the shape of a bull, and there's this side door that can be opened and closed, right? And there's a place right underneath this bowl where a fire can be started. Well, the person to be executed or tortured, I mean, this is execution rather than torture, but would be put inside the brass bowl. The door would be closed and the fire would be lit. It would literally be roasting the person to death, like literally roasting. And this bowl was designed specially, had like a channel going out of the bull's mouth, like a hole into the where the person was, who was tied up. They couldn't really escape, so that the person would scream out of agony, and it would sound. The sound would get distorted and actually sound like a bull's like the bellowing of a bull. Really creative, if you ask me. Like these are brutal and horrible, but you can't deny how creative they were. The next one is called the Heretic's Fork. Well, it's like a piece of metal containing two bi-pronged forks, so not the 3 or 4 pronged forks we see today, but the two. And one of them goes right up to the chin, and the other one goes against the sternum. And it's held like this, right? And the victim is hung from the ceiling, and the strap is used to hold the forks to the person's throat, and that will mean that you have to be like that, and if you like put your head down, it would impale you and impale the chest and the throat, and not only really hurt you, but potentially kill you. So you couldn't even rest your head because you would be hung from the ceiling and just had to be like that. And the second you went down, and they were pointy. They weren't rounded. No. They were pointy. Then the next one is impalement. Well, I mean, the fourth one, I don't know where it comes from. But this impalement comes from Romania, and there's this guy called Vlad the Impaler, who loved this method, and he's actually the inspiration for Dracula. Well, he is famous for really loving this method, and whilst eating his meal, ordering the impalement of just 20,000 people while eating. And this was a method of execution, so you would sit on a pole, right? And it was really sharp, really thick. And this pole would be raised upright, and you would just slide it down the pole with your own weight, like just. And you didn't die immediately. You would just like pierce your organs. And it would take 3 days for you to actually die. So it was horrible, really brutal, and really painful, as well as slow. It's pure torture, like literal pure torture, and then execution. Gotta say, really creative. Like you can't deny how creative these were. That's why I love these so much. I mean, I would never want one of them to be done on me or anyone I know, but well, the next one is called the neck torture. This was more of a endurance, and this torture, not execution. It was this circle that had little needles or pokes coming out that would go really tight against the person's neck. So, the wood, or metal, and these weren't just like, normal thingies. Like they were really, really sharp. So you couldn't eat and you couldn't lower your head because like by eating, that's how your food, your throat moves, and you would get it would impale you. If you lowered your head, the shape of your throat also changes. So that would also impale you. Pure torture, like literal pure torture. This is horrible. This is quite common. The impalement was quite common in Romania. The bull, relatively common. The heretic's fork, quite common, but not. Out of these four that I've said right now, the neck torture was the most common. Well, the next one is called the tub. And this tub is, they put the convicted person in a tub, and they fill the tub with like stuff, and also paint the person's face, not with paint or anything, but with milk and honey, and leave the person in the tub outside. Well, nothing happened. Well, you'd be wrong. Flies would start to come in and be attracted to the honey, to the milk, and more flies would go in and just feed on the person, literally feed on the person. So this was regularly, and at one point the victim would just be there sitting in its own excrement. So they wouldn't let the person leave. So at one point they would poo themselves, and that would attract even more flies. And at one point the tub would become filled with maggots, and these worms would devour the body and decay it. They would decay the body while the person was still alive. Brutal. It's just brutal. The next one is the coffin torture, and this was, all these were kind of public, but this one was on the streets, literally displayed on the streets. This is more in the Middle Ages, and it was an amazing torture technique and also execution. Well, it was placed inside a metal cage that was just about the size of a human body. So average human body. If you were obese, you would struggle even more because the coffin would not be your shape, so you have to. It was pointy and it wasn't really pointy, but there were bars and you would be really pressed. But that's the least of your worries. Fitting in the cage, the least of your worries. You would be left outside, and they were hung from a tree or the gallows, or even public squares, anywhere. And crows would eventually come, see this, and start eating the person. This is very much like the tub. It's kind of similar, and it would just be left there until one point there would just be skeletons hanging from these things. Skeletons just in the town square. You would go for a walk with your kids, see the executed person who is now just a skeleton, the guy currently being executed who is being eaten alive by crows. Normal stuff in the Middle Ages. What can you do? The next one is crucifixion. This is really, I don't think I really need to explain it, but I will because it's really well known. Well, it's the execution method, most notably Jesus Christ. He was executed using this, and you would be nailed to a wooden cross until you died. You just hang there and you died eventually. We lived there for days. Really horrible. And I don't know what else to say because, it's one of the most notable forms of torture and execution. So, on to the next one. The Iron Maiden. And I do not mean the band, although I do believe that the band was named after this. Well, I'm sure you all know what the Iron Maiden is, but it's this iron cabinet that is shaped, it has a face and everything, and inside is just Like there's a lot of like poking thingies. Like I forget the name. Like spikes, and it's just enough to enclose a person. I don't know if you've seen Despicable Me, but there's this one scene where the youngest one, I forget the name. No, not the youngest one, the second oldest one. She goes in with a juice box, and they accidentally close the door, and just blood is seen running out, and it's actually the juice rather than her. But this is actually used in real life. They didn't just obviously invent that for the movie. And well, they couldn't really move because there was spikes everywhere. So just there, and they had to answer questions. And if they moved or resist, they couldn't do anything, and they would just impale themselves. So there was this torture technique, and if the interrogator was feeling a bit murdery, an execution technique, but yeah, it was more used for torture. The next one is the Judas cradle. Again, very religious based torture mechanisms. Well, this one is kind of similar to impalement actually, rather than the crucifix, because you'd think, I mean, at first when I was researching this, I did think that the Judas cradle would be kind of similar to the crucifix, only because Judas and Jesus Christ are biblical figures, and I mean, the relationship is there, you know. Well, you are a prisoner, and if you're a prisoner, you would sit in this pyramid-shaped, like solid pyramid-shaped cradle, and you were tied down and slowly forced down onto the pyramid. It was kind of pointy, and it was just they would think through your bottom, right? And you know the shape of a pyramid is just it starts at a point and then you. Well, the whole intention behind this is to open the person's behind slowly, and just it hurt a lot. I mean, this is like impaling them, and eventually, like if they didn't die, there was definitely an infection because this wasn't clean. Imagine what stuff had to be in there. In the pyramid, it would be blood, excrements, and of course an infection. If you didn't die from this, you would die from an infection. People in the Middle Ages are crazy. I mean, they didn't have that much to do, so they thought of creative torture techniques. Yeah, and I mean, the intention was to try and scare people away from doing stuff that would require for them to be tortured like this. Then the lead sprinkler. This is really interesting. It's like one kind of thing with a bowl with thingies. I don't know that it was pores on the side and was filled with boiling oil or water, molten lead, tar, and what this did was lead sprinkler. It would sprinkle the lead on the victim's stomach, eyes, just on the victim. I mean, lead is incredibly toxic, so you can see where this is going. And it would, apart from doing the lead, this was also used to put the molten silver into victims' eyes, like horrible pain, of course, and eventually death. It's just like by sprinkling stuff on the person. Easy execution method. Torture, and then eventually execution. Then, I mean, one of the most, if not the most famous method of ancient execution, and I say ancient, but this was used until 1977, comes the guillotine. Invented by, I think it's called Charles Guillotine in France. It was really quick. It wasn't, they do sell it as being humane, but it's actually more because it's fast. And, well, I don't think I need to explain what it is, but I will. It's like a frame and it has a blade, and there's a string that lowers and raises the blade, right? And then the executioner would drop the blade on the victim who had his head in this hole, and just separate. And yet it is considered one of the most humane ones because it's just chopping the person's head off. But it wasn't created because how humane it was. It was only created because it was really really quick and cheap. It's just one machine, and unless the blade got stuck or broken, you didn't really need to do much else. Then the rope torture. Well, it's just using rope. Easy to use, easy to find, and cheap. So it was really, really, really common. Well, you would tie a victim to a tree, like naked and defenseless, just leaving there, like leave the victim there for the animals and for anyone who would find them, and just, this is also used to hang victims at the gallows, restrain them to horses or whatever. But it was for the execution and torture. It was mostly used for tying them to a tree. The gallows one, it is pure execution, but it doesn't really count as rope torture because that's a different thing. There's just hanging. Okay, and then the next one, the rack. This is really, really famous. A lot of movies depict this, and anywhere you just Google execution methods, or not execution, torture methods, this is guaranteed to come out. It's one of the most notable ones. So the person would be laid down on a board, wooden frame with like two rods attached to levers, and the victim would be, each limb would be attached to one of the poles with the levers, and they would slowly be the handles would be tightened, and it would stretch the person more and more and more, and the aim wasn't to kill the person, although sometimes it would, but it was just to dislocate the limbs, right? And how do you make sure you dislocate the limbs? Well, until you hear a pop or a crack. And the torturer was like, yeah, no, I cannot be sure that happened. I could just be imagining stuff. So we're going to make sure I'm going to do this until the entire limb is torn from the person's body. Of course, the extent to which this was made and was carried out varies from person to person, from torturer to torturer, sometimes executioner. But it wasn't a method of execution, although some died on the table. Then the next one is the thumb screw. There you go. Thumb screw. And I don't know how to describe it, so there's a picture here, so I'm gonna describe that picture. It's like a screw that has different levels, and this is the main screw, but then it's attached to a level, has two screws, is attached to another level, but you can only turn the first one. And these were used for a lot of things, but mainly for fingers, hands, feet, knees, whatever. There's even a head one. Yeah, a head one, so it would be like tightened and your head would be squashed, and that had to hurt. That one was execution. Torture, but execution. But then the hand one was really common for torture. This one you have to have heard of this. It's called the tongue terror, and the name doesn't leave much to the imagination. It was generally used to cut out the victim's tongues. So, if when you cook and you have these can't think of the word, like cramps, like you get the hot food from the stove or whatever. Well, it's that, but on the one side it's designed to hold the tongue. So you would hold the person's tongue in these things and just rip it out. Not even cut, just rip. It's like tear the tongue out. Tongue terror. Just tear it. That just had to hurt. It's literally tearing the tongue out. Well, the makers, I don't know if the makers, but certainly under the same idea, some people designed the breast ripper. Well, this was mostly used for women, although men were also used, but I mean, as you can probably tell, women have more breasts, and of course, this would be more effective with them. And it was literally the same thing as the tongue ripper, but for the time for breast, so the coverage would be, the shape would be larger. And the claws were red hot. They would be heated and then used to attach to the breast and pulled, and just there were spikes that would hold onto the breast and just pull it out. This was torture, but also this not only to inflict pain, but also to cause massive blood loss. Massive. So, yeah. That had to hurt. Imagine having your tongue, like you would have your tongue pared and then your breast. Men also, I think, suffer from this, but again, not as common because they didn't have the breast. I mean, the prominent breasts. The next one is the cement shoes, and I mean, the name speaks for itself. The person would step into a bucket, wet cement would be poured in, and they would stand there until it dried. Then they would be transported to a lake or to a body of water that was deep enough to cover a person and just thrown in there and let them drown. That is it. That is literally what this is. Like just like setting in cement and boom. A variation of this was, and this one, I mean, I don't know which comes first, but tying a heavy rock to a person's chest or neck or whatever and throwing them into large bodies of water. But the cement shoes ensured that there was no way the person could escape. He would be dragged down and there's nothing you can do about it. The next one is crocodile shears. Well, you know what shears look like, you know what a crocodile looks like. So this was mostly used for attempted regicides. So if you try to kill a king or queen, but king, most popular, most common, I think. There weren't that many queens in medieval ages. Well, you were caught, you would be mutilated, and you would be mutilated using these methods. And be red hot, and they would just clamp down, and especially on limbs, but also on other parts of the body, and tear it out. So it would be hot, and I mean it goes along with the tongue tear and the breast ripper. Same idea. Then the next one is a really famous one, really well known, called rat torture. This was torture and execution at the same time. I don't know if you've seen Game of Thrones, but there's this one scene, I think it's in the second season, where they're in this castle and one guy's getting tortured. And it's really historically accurate. The person would be made to lie down or sit down, and a box with a rat inside would be attached and tied to the person's chest. Now, maybe one rat or a lot of them. And on the other side, it was heated, or a large, or like something would be made to have the rats try to go through the person, and they would just buy the victim's body and just eat the way through the person. Of course, the person would be in agonizing pain and eventually die. So not the best way to spend your weekend, you know? Being eaten alive by rats. Not fun. Then the next one is the chair of torture. This was used up until the 1800s, so not that ancient, and also known as the Judas chair. Judas is not really liked in medieval ages, as you can probably figure out, but it was made of iron, and it does serve kind of the same purpose as the Iron Maiden, but just a chair, and had ranging from 500 to 1500 spikes, and also had heating elements. A lot of these involve heating stuff, like metals. Well, the person would sit down and scream and be interrogated because they couldn't really play their hands because there were spikes everywhere, and this was again to torture the person being interrogated. Also torture those waiting to be interrogated because they would see the pain and just confess on the spot. Depends on the person who's really torturing. Maybe they would just let them off the hook or actually make them sit just because. Then comes the breaking wheel. These are really, really famous. Really notable, and you watch any YouTube video on this, these will definitely come up. And well, you tie the limbs of a victim together to the spokes of a rotating wooden wheel, and then the torturer would turn the wheel around, smashing the victim's limbs with an iron hammer, and it would just be left there on the wheel to die. Now, there's another variation of this, which is even more brutal, and it's kind of similar to the one where they tear the limbs off. The person would be tied to the wheel, and it would be pulled. The limbs would be pulled, but instead of being pulled like evenly, they would just be pulled around, and it would hurt a lot. I mean, personally, I've never gone through this, and I really hope I never do. But accounts just demonstrate how victims would scream in pain because it hurt an awful lot. There was spikes everywhere, and also you would be your limbs would be teared off your body. That can't be nice. Then this one is okay. This is gonna sound really weird, and I'm really gonna get judged for this, but this is my favorite method of execution. And the reason why it's my favorite is because it's the most brutal one, and the one with the most. It's like all in one, you know, all in one, all execution methods in one. In just one quick brutal procedure. And if you know anything about English history, this was the method by which members of Parliament were executed after Charles II came to the throne, because they're sending the death warrant of Charles I, and also how notable members of the gunpowder plot were executed. However, Guy Fawkes managed to avoid this, him being the main one, because this was carried out posthumously, but when he went to the gallows, he jumped and broke his neck, spreading him a lot of pain. But, well, it was only used for high treason offenders, so only the most notable offenders, especially regicide or attempted regicide. And, you would be hanged up until you were just about to die. Then you would be transported to a table, or in some cases, the horse one where they would tear the limbs. Then you would be carried to a table where you would be ripped apart and disemboweled and castrated. These would be shown to you, and just when you were about to die, you would see your entrails, your genitals, whatever, being burned, and then you would be beheaded. A really notable person, apart from Guy Fawkes and posthumously Oliver Cromwell, but he had already died, and other members of the Civil War, William Wallace in the 14th century was executed. I think it's the 14th century, was executed with this method. Next one is called the Republican marriage, and this does not mean marrying a Republican person, even though it does sound like it, but it is more brutal than that. Well, this was mostly used when you had to execute males and females together, just join them, right? You would tie them and dress them so they were naked and tie them together and just into icy water and let them to drown. So their hands would be tied, their legs would be tied so they could move if the water was not available, because you were living in the middle of a place with no coast or no lakes. You would just be run through with bayonets or swords. This was mostly used for priests and nuns, but it wasn't firing. You would suffer. It's not just killing, just torture and suffering. Again, execution eventually. But this was execution. Some of these I mentioned are torture, some of these are execution. It's either or. Oh, this one makes me every time I read about it. The next is called the sword torture, and imagine the gallows but upside down, right? So you would be tied to a structure similar to that of using the gallows, but by your legs, right? And you would be naked. So the blood would rush to your head, and you'd be conscious during the entire time. Anyway, what was the procedure itself? Well, as the name suggests, two people with this giant saw would come up and just pass your like cut you through the middle, just you. And if the executioner was feeling really brutal that day, they would only be cut up until the abdomen, just to ensure the person would be really suffering for a long amount of time. If you were feeling humane, you would cut the person entirely. But if you wanted to see them suffer, just to the abdomen, and that's it, because you are a humane person. And the last one I'm going to talk about is the Spanish donkey. Well, this was a wooden board with a bee wedged on top of it. This victim, they would be naked, and put astride, and weights would be placed on the victim, and especially on the victim's feet, and the wedge would eventually slice through the person, killing them. So, not a good way to die, Well, those are 25 methods of torture or execution, sometimes same thing. And you can see these were brutal. Nowadays, executions are carried out through lethal injection, electric chairs, hangings, firing squads, but none of these methods, thank God. And torture in civilized countries and civilized groups do it, just interrogations. In other uncivilized parts and civilized groups, they do use physical beating downs. But I don't think anywhere in the world that I know of uses these brutal methods of torture and execution, which are Anyway, that is pretty much it. It's one of my favorite parts of history because it just shows how brutal the human race can be. I love reading about this, even though it's horrible. I just love reading about it. Anyway, that is it. There's not much else to say. So thank you for watching. Bye.